Alright guys, welcome to the tutorial for the month of February. In this one we're going to be talking about warm versus cool colors, a fundamental of color theory. In this tutorial we'll be going back to a more beginner friendly topic in warm versus cool, but this is absolutely one of the bedrocks, one of the foundations of being able to paint effectively. And anytime we talk about color theory, the information can be a lot to absorb. So I'm going to try to do my best to cover this topic in a way that is as easy to understand as I know how. With that being said, we got to jump through a couple of sections here. I want to start off with some theory, some basic color theory. I'm going to show you guys some graphs, but don't worry, this video won't be all graphs. And then we'll go on to some examples, some demonstrations, and by the end of this video, I'm hoping that you guys will get a good understanding of what is a warm color, what is a cool color, how they work together, and how you can spot them in your references, how you can use them in your paintings. With that being said, let's get into the first part of our tutorial. So just to start off, we gotta talk about the color wheel that you see right here. Now, color theory has been around for a long time, and the concept specifically of warm and cool colors has been around for hundreds of years and has had a pretty big impact on the way we paint. So the most basic, most fundamental understanding of this concept is when you break it down into 6 colors. On the warm side, we have yellow, orange, and red. On the cool side, we have green, blue, and purple. That's it. The dividing line runs between green and yellow, as well as red and purple. So this is the foundation, this is the base of this entire concept and how it works. And you can see there are 2 transitional points from cool to warm and from warm to cool, as well as 2 peaks. So these 2 areas here are going to be the peak, the highest level of cool and the highest level of warm that you can get. And where this peak comes into play is when you're thinking of a cool color, you're thinking of it being shifted towards the blues, and blue is the epitome of cool. Whereas when you're thinking of a color that's going towards the warm side, you're thinking of a color that's transitioning into a golden yellow, kind of almost sunset golden hour kind of color. So that's the cool peak, that's the warm peak, okay? These are important things to keep in mind as we get a little bit deeper and a little bit more complex. Now, that's the very basic concept. Hopefully you guys can all understand this, but it gets only more complicated from here. It's probably gonna give us a headache, but we'll try our best. So the previous graph showed 6 colors. This one shows us 12. Now there is a clear line here between cool and warm that divides this kind of warm green and this normal cool green and this warm red versus this kind of magenta red. But if we were to say, use a smudge tool like this, well, now where does the warm start and where does the cool end, right? It gets a little bit confusing. Let's do the same for this side. Well, now where do we go? Now here's the way I like to think of it, okay? When you're looking at a color in this range and you're just not sure if it's warm or if it's cool and you have to categorize it somehow, try to think to yourself, how much orange do I see in this color versus how much blue do I see in this color? Does it lean towards one side in my eyes? And oftentimes, this is gonna be a pretty subjective kind of understanding. And just to drive that point home, okay, this is very subjective. Take a look at this. These are the visible colors that we can see, and this graph doesn't even cover all of it. Now we can spin this thing around, okay, and let's look for where the cool starts and where the warm starts. Like we've talked about before, the warm is going to consist of yellow, of orange, and of red. And the cool colors are going to consist of green, blue, and purple. So by that standard, we can understand that somewhere in this range, the green is going to transition from a blue biased green here to a orange biased green here, a warmer green that you might see. And somewhere down here, you can see this purple is going to be transitioning from a blue biased purple to a more warm reddish orangish kind of purple. And some of the colors in this area might be ambiguous. They might not fall into a certain category, but it's up to your subjective analysis as to where you want to place it. So as you guys can see, there are rules about what colors are warm and what colors are cool, but the transition between the two can oftentimes be blurred. Now, regardless of that fact, we have to understand that in order for our paintings to look compelling in terms of their color harmony, it's always good to have a mix of warm and cool colors. So hopefully that explains the concept of what constitutes a warm and a cool color, as well as why sometimes you might be confused as to which color falls into which category. Because there definitely is a blurred line somewhere in the purple and in the green. And not everyone's always going to agree on whether a purple or green is warm or cool. So just understand that there's a bit of nuance there. Now, so far with what we've talked about, we've been moving in a single dimension. Okay, we've been just following this one single line around the outside of this circle. But there's a lot more to it than just that. And this is where you might start getting a little bit of a headache. But I'm going to try to make this as simple to understand as possible. Now, if we're moving in a line in a single dimension, if you were to go from orange to, let's say, this blue right here, you would have to take this path along the outside of the circle in order to get there. You would have to get all these colors in order to transition from orange to blue. But in most real life everyday scenarios and references that you might see and in artwork that you might see, we're not getting all of these vibrant colors, because then every single painting would look like a psychedelic mess. Instead, what's happening is if you want to go from this color to this color, oftentimes you'll see that the colors that are present in real life will not take this path, but they'll take a path of least resistance. So instead of this big curve, you're going to get a more gentle curve. Now, take note of the colors along this curve and the level of saturation there is. Okay, so as you move from this orange into the blue, you're going to be crossing yellow, you're going to be crossing green, you're going to be crossing teal, and then you're eventually going to land in a saturated blue. Now, what's happening here is when you move into the yellows, look how desaturated it becomes on this scale, right? And then as you move into the greens, look how desaturated that becomes. Now, this graph is by no means perfect. This curve is by no means like a law or anything, but it kind of represents a concept that I think is important. And that is, if you're transitioning from a warm color to a cool color and they happen to be really far apart on the color spectrum, like that, for example, or like that, then this transitional path is going to take the path of least resistance, which is going to bring it into the grays. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. As your color transitions from one extreme to the other extreme, in between that is going to be an area of desaturation. Now, this is not the case for every single warm to cool transition though. And what do I mean by this? Well, this is another area of color theory. So if you're transitioning from, let's say, this green over to this tealish green, okay, you're still within a family of analogous colors, which means that these colors are closely related to each other. So now what happens is when you move from this point to this point, well, the colors are going to still take the path of least resistance, but in this case, they are not going to go all the way down to the grays, because that's not the path of least resistance anymore. In this case, they're going to just slide right over like that. So same thing here. Let's say you want to go from a red to a yellow. Well, path of least resistance is that way. So you're just going to transition over it because these are in the same family of colors. Now, I know this is a lot of theory, but hopefully you guys are following me here. As we get into some demos and some examples, you're going to see this a lot more clearly. And speaking of examples here, I want to show you guys one real quick so that you guys can see this kind of path of least resistance in action. So in this piece right here, which is a great example for this, what you're going to find is a balance of blue as well as orange, which are on the opposite ends of the warm and cold spectrum. What I want you guys to pay attention to is the way these colors transition into each other. When you're looking at this painting, you can tell that the colors blend together very smoothly. Everything's very harmonious and nothing really jumps out at you. Now, there's a reason for this. Let's take our eyedropper tool, okay? Let's go into the oranges here. Now, look how saturated that color is. I'm gonna move from this orange up to this blue, and take note of the way this little dot travels in this square, okay? So we're gonna go from this orange, very saturated, and as we move up, look how the hue shifts to the red and the dot starts moving towards the grays. Look at that, it's moving further and further into the grays, and the hue is shifting towards the blues. Look how gray that becomes, right? At this point, now it starts to go into the blues, and it starts to bounce back. Now the saturation is back at this point, whereas before, you can see it was almost touching the edge. So let's go a little bit faster. Let's take a look at the travel path of this dot. See that little bounce that it does at the end before it gets to the gray? See that little bounce there? That's these colors taking the path of least resistance, which is going down towards desaturation and then re-emerging as a different color. When we're talking about colors at the opposite ends of the warm and cool spectrum, so here and here, you're gonna see this absolutely everywhere. So for example, here's a blue. Look how it transitions into this orange. Look at how saturated it gets as you get into this orangish red. Now, coming back down, gray, and then saturated into the blue. So the dot kind of comes down and then does a bounce and then comes back out. There's a saying that I coined that's called gray is the gateway. Okay, remember that. Gray is the gateway. Because if you're going from one end to the other, the gray is what's gonna allow the other color to come in. Okay, so that's a very fundamental aspect of transitioning from cool to warm on a very extreme level, like you see here or here, for example. Now, you don't have to be too meticulous with the way you manage your transitional colors, because as we start rendering, you're gonna see that a lot of it kind of works itself out. So don't worry too much about it, but I just wanna put that concept out there so that you guys can understand why certain colors and color combinations look harmonious, whereas other ones seem to clash with each other. Now, we cannot talk about warm versus cool colors without talking about overall compositions of paintings and of reference images. So let's treat these like reference images. When I first look at an image for a painting, usually what I'm looking for is the overall color that kind of underpins the entire piece. And in most cases, pieces that are pleasant to look at have a combination of warm and cool, but they're not always equally distributed. Let's start with this piece right here. What we're gonna find is an overwhelmingly cool composition. Look at the length of this blue bar. Okay, so that's kind of what I estimate the amount of cool colors versus warm colors to be. The warm colors in this piece kind of come across in the face of our character, on the skin of our character. As I move across with the eyedropper tool, everything else seems to be in the blues, right? And then you come down here a bit and there's some warmth. It's mostly blue, but you might get a hint or two of warmth right there. Okay, and this is what we would call color balance. I recommend you guys try this exercise out, find a couple of references or find some paintings and take a look at their color balance. Try to eyeball it and gauge what percentage of that painting is warm and what percentage of that painting is cool. This is a really good exercise to just train your eyes to be able to see the difference between the warm and cool colors and just start to be aware of it. Because when you first approach a reference and you're first laying down your underpainting, if you mistakenly put down a warm color for a cool color or a cool color for a warm color, you might be in a bit of trouble in the later stages of your rendering. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, jumping down here into this painting, it might not be like super apparent to you the first time you look at it that this is overwhelmingly warm, but let's go in with our eyedropper tool. So taking a look at the hair, look at the hue slider and where this lands. It's very firmly in the red and the orange range, right? So this entire area, even though it's very dark, it's still in the warm range. And because it's in this color range, it's actually going to give your painting an undertone of warmth. And of course, as we move onto the face of the character, you can see everything is firmly within the warm range of colors. So where do the cool colors come in? Well, you're gonna see a bit of it behind. You can see that blue, kind of that ambient lighting coming through the window. There's a bit over there. There's a bit of blue on the rim light here. And there's also gonna be blue here on some of the jewelry items right there on the backs of the chairs. In this case, the cool tones are being used as the accent colors, whereas the warm tones comprised of the main elements of this painting. Now let's take a look at this marshmallow piece. Well, for the most part, what you're gonna get is cool tones in the background, but it actually slowly transitions down here. You can see a bit of that glow of the fire. So some of this color becomes warm. Like right there, for example, you can see it's firmly within the red and orange range. And as you jump onto the clothes here, let's take a look. A lot of this is within the orangey kind of brown range. Again, a very warm kind of tone. And this is all because of the color of the fire kind of casting this bright orange onto the front of the character. Of course, onto the face, there's going to be a lot of orange tones, but it's also going to transition to blues. And the dark colors on this side of this piece, you can see for the most part are cool. They're leaning towards the purples and the blues, right? Even on the back of the shirt, that's a cool blue. right here, cool blue, grayish blue, cool blue right there. So there's a bit more of an equal distribution between cool and warm, and that's why the graph here kind of looks like that. There's a bit of an equal distribution, but I think it leans a little bit more into the cools because the warm colors are kind of confined to the front side of this character. So I want you guys to find some references, find some paintings, okay? Go through this exercise. Try to see where you find cool colors, where you find warm colors, and try to make a little map for it. Try to make a percentage chart for it, okay? And this will help you understand the presence of these colors in almost every single compelling composition. And that brings us on to another concept concerning cool and warm colors, and also colors in general. This is something that you always want to think about. And I like to refer to this as relativity. So what we're gonna see here are two sets of spheres. And this one is done in a bright orange color. It's very warm, it's monotone, there's no blue or cool anywhere. This one is done in blue, there's no warmth on it anywhere. And as we move over to this side, you can see there is a combination of warm and cool. This one as well, combination of warm and cool. So the cool becomes the main light source, and the warmth is the light source in the shadow. Whereas for this one, the warmth is the main light source, and the cool becomes the light source in the shadow. So what I want you guys to take a look at here is the level of intensity of this highlight on the sphere. This blue appears quite intense in this scenario. So does this orange. It really looks like a pop of color. But if we use our eyedropper tool, you can see that even though this color just absolutely pops out of that sphere, it's not as saturated as this yellow that's present on the entire surface of this sphere, right? This color pops, whereas this one seems to kind of just melt into the entire sphere. Same thing on this side, right? Look at this blue. Let's use the eyedropper. Look how desaturated that is compared to this blue. And this blue melts back into the entire sphere, whereas this one starts to pop. Now, the reason for this is because of relativity. When you have a sphere that's full of warm colors that transitions into a very subtle gray, very muted, and the moment you add a little splash of saturation there, it just pops against that background. The surrounding colors here is fooling your brain into thinking that this color is more saturated and brighter than it actually is. And just look at this color on its own. If I turn this off, look how pastel and light this color becomes. Whereas in the context of here, it becomes a really rich, cool blue, right? So the exact same thing's happening down here. Now this color is not very saturated at all, but when you surround it and complement it with cool colors, desaturated colors, the moment you add in a splash of brightness and saturation, that color just starts to pop, and it gives you the illusion of warmth that is actually higher in intensity than it's supposed to be. You can do a little experiment here. Take this color, this highlight color that's so bright on the sphere, and just put it onto the orange one, and you can see it disappears. It fades into the background. Again, this is the whole concept of relativity. The way this color is going to appear depends entirely on the other colors surrounding it. And while we are on this page, let's take a look at the transitions between the colors, okay? Remember that little bounce into the grays and then back into saturation that I was talking about before? Well, take a look at this little dot right here, okay? As we move down into the shadows, look at that rapid decline in saturation. And then it comes back out into the yellows. It comes back out a different color. Again, guys, gray is the gateway. So it goes into the grays, comes back out a different color, right? Same thing on the bottom here. So this is orange. It's getting desaturated as we go down, desaturated, and it comes out of the grays a different color. It comes out blue. Let's go faster. You see that little bounce? It's like a little U shape. It's like a little U shape on that dot, right? Here as well. Look at this dot. It's like a little U shape that bounces from top to bottom, right? So just something to keep in mind for dramatic cool and warm transitions like these ones. Now, I've drawn a little burb here, and I want you guys to just use this page to experiment, okay? You can download the PSD file on the Patreon post and just try it out for yourself, okay? Let's take a warm red color, maybe not fully saturated, but let's try to paint this burb in a realistic way. Let's get this nice saturated warm red here, and maybe let's transition this into a cool cyan color. So how do we do this? Now, normally when I transition colors, I kind of let my brush with pressure opacity do most of the work for me. And then with the knowledge that I have of how colors work and how they transition into each other and how you can make it look harmonious, I will edit the final result. So here, let's take the final color that we want it to transition into, maybe a cyan like that. And I'm gonna turn on pressure opacity here. What we're gonna do is we're just gonna glaze this right over what we see. So you can see here in the areas that are really nicely transitioned, the red is gonna go down in saturation, down in saturation, down in saturation, then come back out in saturation into a different color. Okay, so your brush can kind of do all that work for you, but I want you guys to understand that process. Now look at the hue slider here as well. We're going from red to orange to yellow to green, and then it jumps into cyan. Why does that happen in this transition? Well, you can't just jump straight from red and avoid all the other colors and go to green. You can't just do that. So when you do a soft glaze and a soft blend, the colors are kind of moving in this direction into your final color, which is going to be this right here. So usually what I do is I apply this glaze, soften it up with your smudge tool, right? We don't have to worry about every single transition because a lot of times the software that you're working in can actually do most of this for you, but you do have to remember this path, okay? So you're taking this path, desaturation and more saturation, path of least resistance. So this gray transition area is very important because the moment your color gets desaturated down here, you're opening up the doors for this color to come in. If you were to take, let's say, this color here, which is a transitional color, and you made it very saturated in this area and you applied it like that in between the two colors, what you're going to get is a splotchy and kind of brown and overall unpleasant and unnatural effect that doesn't look as believable. Again, this all goes back to the path the colors are traveling in. Okay, so you have to understand there's a point of desaturation as you move from one end of the spectrum to the other end. Now, once you're out of the gray zone, you can start to add even more saturation because this area here now acts as a launching pad. This color is analogous to this color, so you can apply this color here with minimal consequences, just like this, and it looks very natural because this would be a naturally occurring transition. So with these transitions, it looks like the burb is being lit from the top by a warm light and from the bottom by a cool light. And usually, you know, when you have two light sources that are kind of converging, you're gonna get a bit of a core shadow in the middle, right? So you can afford to make this area a bit darker. You can blend that out just like that. And at the edge of this gray transition zone, we can even add a splash of saturation. And on the very top of the burb, you can add maybe even a spot of highlight, just like that, right? And coming back in using our smudge tool, making sure everything is smoothly blended. And I'm gonna add even more saturation to the bottom here, just to, you know, drive this point across. But you can see here, we've got a beautifully rendered double-sided lighting for this burb. Okay, so let's put this off to the side. Okay, and you can really try this with any color. Let's try maybe an orangish, kind of yellowish color. Maybe the burb is in sunlight, so let's apply this kind of very warm color. And for the shadow, maybe we'll make it a bluish color. And this one might be a bit less saturated, for example. So we can go for something like that. Again, blending this out. Take note of the colors here, okay? So now we're going from yellow, and if I'm correct, it should be going down in saturation towards the greens and into the blues, just like that. So a little bit faster, yellow, saturation, dip, and it comes back out into blue. Now just to make this look even more convincing, we can make this blue even darker. We can apply an even darker blue here. Again, smudging this out, blending it out, and it looks like a nice kind of soft light that transitions from the top to the bottom of the burb. And once you get past, you see this zone of desaturation here? Once you get past that zone and you've entered the blue range, you're kind of free to play around. You can bring a lighter color in here, just like that. You can add more saturation. You can go as far as you want. You can add almost a blue rim light to the bottom, just like that. And it makes sense because these colors are analogous, so they can kind of interplay with each other. And on top here, you can take this yellow, you can add a slightly darker yellowish color to the mix, just to accelerate that transition from the light to the shadow. Again, blending it out, giving it a nice three-dimensional look. Going up top, you can make this even lighter. Looking at that, now we've got a nice solid transition. See how it dips down to the gray, gives room to the blue to come in, and then with this blue in place, this is our stepping stone into more saturation for our cool colors. Once you're comfortable with this concept, you can play around, because when you go from orange to blue, you can either take this path or you can take this path. For the most part, what I find to be more aesthetically pleasing is going from orange in this direction towards the blue. It's kind of like that. And I use that kind of rendering for a lot of my skin pieces. So let me just show you guys that here. As you get more comfortable, we can add a darker desaturated blue to give you a sense of a core shadow, maybe something a little bit darker there, right? Blend this out. And then since we're transitioning from yellow into orange, we'll move downwards, right? We'll get a bit more saturation, a little bit more darkness, just like that. And then we'll move down into the reds, a little bit darker, a little bit more saturation, just like that. And you're gonna see a lot of this kind of transitioning in my skin rendering. And now we can get some of this bright color up top just to accentuate this contrast. Now, this is not something that you have to do, but this is more of a stylistic choice for me because I like my paintings to have a warmer kind of tone. And when you transition from orange over this side into blue, it's a cooler kind of transition, whereas from this side into blue, it's a warmer transition. Now, the reason as you get to the really light part, it's desaturated is because it's so bright that the color cannot remain saturated. If I were to put this bright yellow here, you can see it almost doesn't appear as bright as before, right? So with this kind of bright color, it's a bit desaturated, but coming down into the transition, you're gonna see saturation, saturation, desaturation into the grays. The gray is the gateway. It opens the door to the blue, and the blue comes in and becomes more saturated. Okay, so that's the simplest way I have of explaining how I like to transition from warm to cool. And honestly, the painting process for it itself is very simple. You're literally overlaying two different colors and just smudging it out. But in order to take it to the next level, to be able to stylize it and render it the way you want to, you have to understand how it works. And that's what I'm trying to explain to you guys here. So now, with all that being said, I want to do a couple of quick examples with you guys so that you can kind of see some of this stuff in a real reference scenario. Now, taking a look at this reference, the first thing I like to consider is what colors are present. And a big part of that is whether it's a warm or a cool tone for this painting. And this reference is going to be relatively simple. We're starting off with a very simple one. So if we use the eyedropper tool, you can see that for the most part, actually almost the entire face and the skin on the chest area, all of this rests in the warm range. And as we get onto the hair, you can see a lot of this also rests in the warm range. And as we get down a bit towards the edges, now you're getting a little bit more green. But for the most part, I wouldn't classify all of this green as cool because there's a bit of nuance in this area. So this is almost a neutral kind of ground. The cool colors that we see in this composition come through in the clothing, which is mostly blue, cyan, and a very bluish kind of green that you might see. So that makes our job pretty simple. Now, when we're trying to render something like this, you kind of want to pick out the color that's going to be your base color for the skin. The reason this makes our job really simple is because there's a very clear divide between the cool and the warm. In this case, most of the warm colors are going to be present on the head and the face and the skin of the character, and the cool colors are going to be pretty much restricted to the clothing area. You're not going to see too much intermingling between the cool and the warm. I'm just going to make this render really quick so that I can show kind of the gist of this concept. Now, since everything on the face is going to be in the warm range, we can confidently apply a warm leaning shadow here as well. Once all that is said and done, let's take our blue and do an application of that for her clothing. So now this composition looks much better to me because there is an interplay between cool and warm colors. And for the most part, when you're painting a subject, whether it be an environment or a character, you want to make sure that there's a presence of both warm and cool colors. It doesn't necessarily have to be super saturated, but having a contrast of warm versus cool in your paintings is going to make them a lot more interesting to look at. Now here you can see, since we have our warms and our cools kind of delegated to their own sections, we can play around within these color groups. We can add the cyans that you might see on the sleeves, like that. We can add some of the lighter blues that you might see on the front of the shirt as well, right? There's a lot of room to play around here within the respective color groups. And same thing for the skin. You can start adding some more warm reds into the face. You can start adding some warm transitional reds between the light and the shadow. For the most part, this will be quite simple to do. And just like that, you can see the warm colors stay where they are and the cool colors stay where they are. But you might get a bit of cool coloring in the eyes, like so. Coming up to the hair, you can see there's a orange kind of rim light. Again, you're just pushing the saturation of the warmth in this scenario, right? So we're just pushing the saturation a bit, adding that rim light, which plays into this dark brown. And if we go by the reference here, you can see even the highlights on the face are a very bright and slightly desaturated kind of orangey yellowish color. So you can choose to do that as well, right? You can add a little highlight just like that, highlight on the eyes too, highlight on the cheeks, and highlight on the forehead, and you can choose to blend this out. Now this scenario that we've studied here is very straightforward, and in most of the references that you find, this is kind of going to be what you see. A lot of the warm colors are going to be organized in one spot, and the cool colors are going to kind of be organized into their own spot. And this gets a little bit more advanced, but here, let's say I want to stylize this character a bit. What we can do is, let's take a look at the relationship between the skin tone and the highlight right here. So what's happening here is, let's look at the skin tone. Look how saturated that is. Look at the level of saturation. And as we get into the highlight, it moves so much closer to the grays, right? So saturation versus gray. Look at the highlight on the tip of the nose, right? It's very desaturated, whereas here, on the cheeks and everything, it's very saturated. Now here's something to keep in mind. The more saturated a warm color is, the further it is from the cool. But the moment you start moving towards desaturation, your color's actually getting closer to the side of the cool colors, right? So like we said before, we'll use this graph right here. So this is maximum warm, but this is leaning a bit more towards the cool. So when you put this color next to this color, this one's gonna appear cooler, right? In the context of stylization, we might interpret this leaning towards the grays and this desaturation as the opposite end of the color spectrum, as the cool end of the spectrum. So you can actually exaggerate these highlights and you can make them a cool blue color, if you so wish. Just like this, let's get a blue highlight on the nose ridge. You can kind of glaze this color over, and sometimes the final result might not be exactly blue. It might be a gray color, but it gives you the illusion of a blue color. And I personally do this a lot on my drawings just to give them a little bit more visual interest. You know, once you finish the rendering for the character and you're applying the final details and the highlights, you can really start to play around with where the colors fall on the color spectrum. So now, having done this, you can see this very muted gray color. It looks blue when it's surrounded by this orange. And once you've opened up this gateway here, remember guys, gray is the gateway. Once you've opened that up, you can add an actual blue highlight in there and it's not gonna look entirely out of place. So look, now you're transitioning from gray into blue. And that is a way to stylize your colors in terms of warm and cool. We can add this blue here. We can add a bit more blue here. Now, gray into blue, and it doesn't look entirely out of place. You can do the same thing for pretty much everything else that you see. You can apply a light layer of glaze, and if you want, you can use that gray as a gateway to transition into an actual blue color, just like that. That's a way that I like to stylize a lot of the rendering on my characters. You guys can feel free to give that a try. I've taught you all of the reasoning and the theory behind why this works so that you guys can understand where you can apply this, okay? So that's example number 1. Now here's example number 2. In this reference, what we're gonna find is, again, a mass of warm colors, but in this case, we're gonna get a cool color coming from the window, which is gonna be sort of an ambient light that's gonna cast almost a rim light on the character. And as we go over this character with our eyedropper tool, you can see a lot of this is in the cool range. A lot of this color falls into the blues and the cyans. So what this is telling us is the light source coming from there is a cool light source. It's going to cast a cool color in contrast with the warm color on this side of the character, which is being cast by this very warm light source, which is a fire. Now, even on the front side of the face of the character, you can see a bit of this rim light. And in the reference, it's very gray. So compared to this color here, which is extremely saturated, compared to that color, you can see this area is going to appear much cooler by comparison. So what can we do in this scenario? Well, we're going to take a nice saturated dark orange kind of color and just apply that onto the face. And the jacket area is also a warm color, but just much darker, right? So this entire section is warm. So there you go. There's some warmth. And going up into the hair, again, warm colors all around in the shadow area, because I'm assuming this room is being lit by a really warm light source, which is this candle light, right? So coming up here, everything is warm, very warm. The majority of this painting is comprised of warm colors. I would say it's almost 90% to 10%, but that 10% we can really exaggerate. So there we go. Once we have this, you can add some variation in depth of the shadows, just like that. Right, just some variation there. Maybe a bit more variation on the neck, on the side of the face, just like that. You know, blend this out, blend that out. Looks good. Now time for this rim light. Okay, so we can see that it's pretty much a gray color. It's almost devoid of color. But we want to exaggerate this a bit. Okay, we want to create a level of contrast that makes this composition look interesting. So knowing that the light source here is blue in its hue, even though it's very desaturated, we can kind of exaggerate this. Okay, so I'm going to pick a blue color, I'm going to saturate it a bit, get it nice and bright, and that's going to be my rim light. Now coming up here, I'm going to apply this blue, and you can see it creates a very pleasing level of contrast with the warm colors that we've already laid down. This just makes your painting look that much more interesting. And this is why I'm always looking for warm and cool relationships when I first look at a reference. It's just another aspect of color theory. And there are so many aspects of color theory that you have to keep in mind when you want to create a composition that looks pleasing to the eye. So here I'm just taking this blue and running it down the nose, the front of the lips, as well as the chin. And contrasting this is going to be a nice bright orangish color right here, indicating the light from the candle. Now what's going to make this pop even more is the background. So the background is also a warm kind of brownish color. So once you lay this background in, take a look at that. Now this blue color is really starting to pop. Again, this is the concept of relativity. You got to think about the other colors that are surrounding this color. And by having all these warm colors here, that makes this blue look that much more intense. Now coming back here, there's a little bit of rim light on the back of the hair. I'm just going to apply that in there. Just like that. And you can see this blue also continues down onto the jacket. So you're going to get a little bit right there. Bit of blue there. You can go really saturated as well once you've opened up that door. And there you go. That's the interplay between cool and warm. You're also going to get a bit of blue in the background. Again, just a mixing of cool and warm colors all together in the back there. Now, even though we can clearly see that this part is blue and it's cool compared to the rest of the painting, I want to show you guys something else here. So this goes back to the concept of relativity. Now, if we just bring the saturation all the way down, okay, now there's no color in there whatsoever, this area still appears cooler than the colors that you see on the face. The reason for this being, once again, this sliver of color is surrounded by other colors that are warmer than it is. So this sliver appears cooler than it actually is. And that's kind of what's happening in the reference, but we decided to add some saturation and exaggerate it. And in doing so, we've produced a painting that's more interesting, that has a combination of warm and cool colors. So there you guys go. That was an explanation of the fundamental concept of warm versus cool colors, how I see it, how I interpret it, and how I apply it into my paintings. And I hope this video has been able to help you guys understand the subject a little bit better. I know it's a lot of information, so it's going to take some time to absorb, but feel free to go through this file, try to make your own warm and cool colored burbs, and go ahead and find some references that you can break down and try to look for the cool and the warm colors, and then apply that into your own painting. You can exaggerate it, you can stylize it, but one thing to always keep in mind is when you have warm and cool in a single painting working in harmony, it makes that painting look so much more compelling. All right, so I hope this has been helpful to you guys. Hopefully I didn't fry your guys' brains, but with that being said, thank you guys so much for your support. Thank you for being here on my Patreon, and thank you for being a part of the best community ever. I really appreciate you guys. With that being said though, I'll see you guys on the next tutorial. Have a good one.